Thanks a lot for attending this session. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes is whether CSR, or some people call it sustainability reporting, should be mandatory. So that's obviously a very normative question that I'm not going to be able to answer in 10 minutes alone. So what I'm really going to do is I'm going to talk about a few issues that I think it's important to think about before we even start thinking about what kind of regime should we mandate. What I'm going to talk about is based on a paper that I have co-authored with Lucy Hale from Wharton and Christian Lloyd from University of Chicago. And in the paper we have, it's basically dealing with whether the US should mandate CSR reporting standards. And so the paper deals with many different issues, but I don't have time to go through all of that now. So what I'm going to do is just talk about two things that I think is important to think about first. So the first thing is, what should be the goal or objective of CSR reporting? And then second, what could be the political issues that will arise once the system is set up and we have to set standards going forward. So let me start with the goals of sustainability reporting. So, I mean, I can see two extremes. So the first goal you could imagine is to make it very narrow and say we're going to only focus on investors. We're going to give investors what they want, and we're not going to care about any other stakeholders. That's one extreme. The other extreme is we're going to say, no, the objective of this reporting regime should be to drive change. For example, reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. So when you look at the debate, in my experience, people that argue for a reporting regime rarely sort of specify which objective they have in mind, and usually it's somewhere in between these two. But I think it's important to think about that before we even start. So let me start with goal number one. So that's the investor focus only. So if that's the approach we're going to take, I think first of all we need to sort of step back and think about why is it actually that sustainability reporting has become such a big topic, right? So we'll take the example of climate change. Well, it's because it affects all of us, right? Because when corporations have their activities, they're imposing externalities on the rest of us. They're emitting CO2, for example, but not really paying the full price for it. The rest of us are paying part of that price. So if you really make a system that's only focused on what investors need, their information needs, then you largely ignore externalities because the cost of those are not carried by the corporation. At least that's true if you think that all that shareholders care about is maximizing wealth. Of course, it's possible it's not all they care about. So investors might have, or some investors at least might have preferences that go beyond shareholder value. And then, of course, externalities would to some extent matter to them because they would now want to use the disclosures to monitor management, not just in terms of their financial performance, but also how are they, their environmental impact, right? So if we think investors have preferences beyond their wealth, then we are moving closer to goal number two. But we could define goal number one really narrowly and say we are only going to focus on financial materiality. If that's the case, then it's not clear that any new reporting regime would be that different from what we have today, right? So in most regimes, certainly here in the US, all material information, financial material information has to be disclosed. Doesn't matter whether it's CSR information or some other information. So then if we still want to go and take this particular path, then the question is, do firms today actually provide all financial material information when it comes to CSR? And if the answer is yes, they do, then the status quo, what we have today, is actually goal number one. I think there are reasons to be skeptical that they're disclosing all financial material information related to CSR. And I think that because many of these environmental issues are difficult to measure and they have long-term impact, meaning it's very difficult to assess whether something is material or not. Right? And it's difficult for investors to know whether firms are actually giving them the information that's material, and therefore difficult to hold them accountable. So non-compliance is a concern, right? But if non-compliance is the issue, then the question is, do we really need a new reporting regime, or would it be better to sort of maybe adjust the one we have now and then just add more enforcement on this particular topic? So let me move now to goal number 2, driving change. If that's going to be our objective of a new CSR reporting system, then it's going to be all about externalities, right? It's going to be all about how does activities by the corporation affect the world outside, like the outside world, right? So if that's what we have as an objective for CSR standards, then the question is, why are we really doing this disclosure regime? Why not go with more traditional regulation where we just force firms to not disclose to not emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases, more than a certain amount of greenhouse gases? So one answer to why we still might need reporting is that, well, information could complement other efforts. That's possibly one. Another, maybe more likely explanation, or more reasonable, but that I think is more likely for why people that want to drive change are arguing for this is a political one. I think that, or generally speaking, transparency solutions are easier to agree on. It's harder politically to argue against transparency than it is to argue against traditional regulation. And that's because it's seen as sort of less intrusive. However, if that's sort of what we have in mind as a reason for doing CSR, then it's important to remember that we have lots of evidence that says that transparency regimes are not without problems either, and they're not necessarily better than traditional regulation, right? So we have evidence that shows there are many unintended consequences of disclosure regimes. And one thing that's important to remember is many of the issues within CSR are a little bit complex to understand. Like, what does emission of one particular gas relative to another mean? And so if consumers, for example, don't understand the disclosures, or other stakeholders, then, and therefore not reacting in a rational way, then it's not clear that companies are going to react in a rational way either. So, okay, let me move now to the politics of sustainability reporting. So here, so now what I'm thinking about here is, let's say we have a regime in place and somebody has to set reporting standards. What is going to be some of the political issues to think about? So here, relative to financial reporting or securities regulation, I think it's important to think about how much broader the potential user group is when it comes to CSR information, right? And it's often also relative to securities regulation and financial reporting. It's likely going to be much more politically charged when it's CSR reporting. So let me give you an anecdote to illustrate that. And I'm going to use a provision in the Dodd-Frank Act from 2010 here in the US, where that basically mandated conflict mineral disclosures. So the objective of this particular provision was to dissuade companies from engaging in trade that supports a conflict in Africa, in and around the Democratic Republic of Congo. So when the SEC was implementing that, or trying to implement that new rule, they sent out for comment letters, right? They got 700 comment letters back. More than 60% of those were from unusual suspects, sort of the general public and NGOs. And their arguments were centered around, they were almost all for it, the regulation, but the arguments were centered around the severity of the conflict and the human cost of conflict. Then there were probably a little bit less than 40% of sort of more usual suspects, so businesses, trade and industry organizations, and so on. And so they were not against it, but they would sort of argue, hey, there's some reporting costs to consider here. Imagine now that you're a standard setter and you have to sort of sit and weigh off these different objectives, right? Like, what is the human cost of conflict versus reporting cost? That's going to be really difficult for a standard setter to weigh those two against each other. And it's certainly arguments when it comes to human cost of conflict and severity of conflict, are very unusual arguments in a general debate on, say, accounting standards. Okay, so this could give rise to some political issues. So one thing I think to consider is, can non-elected officials make such decisions? Right? Don't we potentially need some democratic oversight to make these trade-offs? And then the second one, more practical, is how should we do cost-benefit analysis, right? Presumably we will need to take into account potential social benefits, lower emissions, but that's going to be very difficult to do in a framework. It's already difficult today to do cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so let me just end by saying there are many more arguments in the paper and and research questions if you're into research. The paper will be available on the website if you're interested. So thank you very much for attending this session.